My name is Delaney Whitlow, and I'm going to be talking about an analysis of operant conditioning in a quasi-therapy setting, which is a journal that was written by J. Maurice Rogers. So a little introduction into this journal is that this whole experiment focused on using operant conditioning for people with anxiety. So a little background information. For operant conditioning to be successful in a therapy setting, it is important that the experiments are conducted as similar to psychotherapy as they can be, but also that they remain objective and scientific in nature. And by doing this, the results from research is more applicable to psychotherapy. So the purpose of this experiment was to see if an interviewer can change self-referent verbalizations by applying simple reinforcements to their participants. The hypothesis for this experiment was that the interviewer will be able to change the subject's self-reference verbalizations by consistently using reinforcements of statements when interviewed, and that these reinforcements will help to change the subject's concept of themselves, which will be measured by personality tests. So the methods for this experiment were that the researchers set up a quasi-therapy setting, and the participants were interviewed and asked multiple questions pertaining to their personality and personality traits. The subjects were also given personality tests, which were used to measure the degree of change within the subject before and after the experiment. When interviewed, reinforcement was used when participants used self-reference verbalizations. So the interviewers used a and a nod of their head as reinforcement for the desired behavior, whether it be positive or negative self-references. The subjects were asked to describe their personality traits and characteristics. And in total, there were 36 male participants for this experiment. Each subject was randomly assigned into 2 experimental groups and 1 control group, and the groups were labeled A, B, and C. Group A was reinforced for positive self-references, and Group B was reinforced for negative self-references, and Group C was not reinforced at all. It was the control group. A total of 6 10-minute interviews were conducted for each subject, or 216 total for all of the subjects combined. And all of the interviews were recorded and analyzed to see if there was a relationship between reinforcement provided by the interviewer and self-references from the subjects. A total of 4 personality tests were also administered both before and after the experiment to see if change occurred among those in the experimental groups. 2 of the tests that were used were the adjective self-descriptions test and the sentence completions tests. These 2 tests were used for self-referent means, and the other 2 tests, which were the Taylor Scale of Manifest Anxiety and the Q-Short Emotional Test, were used to show the degree of personality change that occurred after the experiment. Lastly, a 1-hour-long interview was used to determine if the subjects were aware of themselves being conditioned and to gain knowledge on their reaction to the experiment. So to score the self-reference test and the sentence completion test, the reliabilities were created by comparing ratings from 2 impartial judges. The product moment reliability coefficients that were used for this rating were 0.83 and 0.95. The questionnaires that were used in the adjective self-description test were coded by 3 impartial judges, and the code was assigned based on a majority agreement of the 3 judges. The results from this experiment were gathered into 2 tables, and the t-test was used to compare and find meaning in the results. The results in Table 2, which were changes in each group, were compared with the results from other groups to find the significance. In Table 3, which showed the operant response level from Interview 1, it was compared to the conditions response level from Interviews 2 through 6, and the t-test was also used to compare the significance between these results. In Table 3, Group B, which was reinforced for negative self-references, had an increase in response, and Group A and Group C did not show a change in response. Regarding positive self-references, Table 3 showed that Group A had no increase in response, and Group B and Group C had a decrease in response. So based on the data that was gathered, the hypothesis from the research was not supported. There was not a significant relationship between being conditioned and anxiety, and there was also not a significant relationship between being conditioned and emotional adjustment in either experimental group. So to talk about the discussion, they discussed another experiment that was done by an experimenter named Taffel. And in Taffel's experiment, which was conducted with hospitalized psychiatric patients, found that there was a positive correlation between anxiety and being conditioned. And while this finding is valid in the scientific community, It could be in part due to that his participants were hospitalized psychiatric patients who had higher anxiety due to their conditions, whereas this study's participants were not psychiatric patients. We're going to be discussing some operant conditioning examples. The first one that we're going to discuss is positive and negative reinforcement and punishment. So, an example of operant conditioning with positive reinforcement for stress is when someone completes a task without getting stressed, they will get rewarded with a break. This is positive reinforcement because the person is being given the reward of a break for finishing the task without stress. An example of operant conditioning with negative reinforcement for stress is if the person completes a task without stress, I can take away the next task that they have to do. This is negative reinforcement because I am taking away something like the next task that they don't want to do. By doing this, I am reinforcing not being stressed. An example of operant conditioning with positive punishment for stress is when someone experiences stress, they have to go for a walk. By adding a walk to their day, we can use positive punishment to reduce their stress because we are adding something new. An example of operant conditioning with negative punishment for stress is that if the person completes the task and they get stressed, they have their phone removed from their person. By taking away something that the person wants, they are less likely to repeat the behavior because they know that their phone will be taken away. Examples that I'm going to be discussing is schedules of reinforcement. So for a fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement, every 4 times that a person completes a task without stress, they would get rewarded with something of positive reinforcement, such as a special meal or a snack. By doing this, they know that they will be rewarded after they complete a task without stress 4 times, making sure that they keep engaging in the behavior. For a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement, every 8 to 12 times a person completes a task without stress, they are rewarded with positive reinforcement, such as an extra day off that weekend. By giving them an extra day off every 9 to 12 completed stress-free tasks, they know that they are going to get rewarded, but they don't know exactly when that reward will come, making them more likely to complete their task without stress all of the time. For a fixed interval schedule of reinforcement, if someone was trying to complete a task without stress every week or every 7 days of them not doing the behavior of being stressed, I would reward them with positive reinforcement with something meaningful to them, such as a meal, a prize, sticker, something to show that they are still being rewarded for not engaging in that behavior. By rewarding them every 7 days, they know when the reward will come and they are less likely to not have stress for those 7 days leading up to the reward. For a variable interval schedule of reinforcement, if someone were trying to not have stress, every average of 7 to 15 days, after about every 7 to 15 days, I would reward them with positive reinforcement with something meaningful to them to show them that they are still being rewarded for not having stress. By doing this, they don't know exactly when they will be rewarded, making them more likely to not have stress the entire time. So they could be rewarded the 7th day, they could be rewarded the 12th day, the 13th. It's anywhere in that time span. For a multiple schedule of reinforcement, every time a person sees a green light, they know that they have to not exhibit stress for about 10 minutes to get a break. Every time a person sees a red light, they know that they have to not exhibit stress for 20 minutes to get a break. By seeing the light, they know how long they have to not exhibit stress for. Multiple schedules is a little bit more of a different schedule of reinforcement. It's one of the more difficult ones to convey. So I wouldn't recommend using this one for stress just because it's going to be a very hard setting to get someone in where if they see a certain color light, they know when and when not to exhibit stress. That's not really a good experimental design for stress relief. Conditioning examples, I'm going to be talking about issues with punishment and punishment alternatives. So punishment isn't always the best thing to use for conditioning because it can be very unreliable, and there's sometimes certain situations where punishment is just not applicable to the person and where reinforcement would definitely be a better thing to use to get that person to complete the behavior that you want. So without using punishment, we could change stress through reinforcement. You could reward the participant each time that they do a task without stress, which would be positive reinforcement, or you could take away something that the participant doesn't like doing, or negative reinforcement, each time they complete a task without stress. So for response prevention, you could use response prevention by putting the person in a situation where they would normally exhibit stress. An example is having to put something together under a time constraint, but they wouldn't allow themselves to get stressed, and instead they would start the task and finish it in time. You would tell a person to work on it for an hour a day, and that would make it feel like they're not dedicating a lot of time to it, but they would still be making progress on it and therefore reducing their stress. For extinction with DRA, you could withhold positive or negative reinforcement while the person is stressed and only giving them reinforcement once they have stopped being stressed and they have completed the task. Instead of them getting stressed and giving up, have them take 2 minutes to stand up and do some stretches, then get right back to the task. For extinction with DRI, let's say that when it comes to someone being stressed, a huge stressor is their phone being constantly by them and going off. For extinction with DRI, you would make it so that every time they sit down to complete a task, their phone is either turned off or not next to them, as having their phone next to them increases their stress level. They will be reinforced when the phone is away from them, but not reinforced when the phone is near them. For extinction with DRL, one way that people relieve stress is by cleaning things that don't necessarily need to be cleaned at that time. Cleaning is not a bad habit, but when someone is trying to focus on a task, it can become a big distraction. For extinction with DRL, you would try to hinder the person from getting up and cleaning when they are trying to complete a task. You would reinforce the target behavior of less stress less often if they do end up cleaning. For extinction with DRH, if the person was really working hard on a task and didn't get stressed at all for the whole day, then you would reward them with positive reinforcement because of their behavior being stressed occurred less often than you had hoped for. For extinction with DRO, if a person can complete a task and not get stressed for an hour, then they would get a 10-minute phone break. If they do not meet that hour mark, then the timer is reset and they are not given a phone break. And here are my references for my presentation.